Hello and welcome to the Child Protection and Crisis Learning Network webinar this morning. We are excited to have you all on the line. We're particularly excited to have Amy Ritterbusch with us presenting today. Amy is the coordinator for the Child Protection and Crisis Learning Network's Program Learning Group in Colombia. She's also an assistant professor at the School of Government at the Universidad de los Andes. Before I pass the reins over to her, I just wanted to go through some logistics of the system in case some of you have not used GoToWebinar before. You should have a control panel that shows, they have a few different tabs, including questions and chat. You can feel free at any point during the webinar to send a chat or a question directly to me, Rena Dietz, the organizer. And whether that's a logistical question if you're having trouble hearing or you can't see the presentation, just send that my way. Or if you have a question for Amy, what we'll be doing is we will have Amy present and then we'll have an open Q&A session, question and answer session, where she will answer all of the questions that have been presented throughout the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the reins over to Amy. And just one more quick logistical thing. I will have you all muted throughout the webinar, so if you have a question, do send that to me, because with everyone's background noise, it gets pretty noisy throughout the webinar. So I will turn it over to Amy now. All right, Amy, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Rena.
Great. I am turning the reins over to you.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Ritterbusch, and as Rena said, I'm assistant professor in the School of Government at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. I've been living in Bogota for almost 6 years, and today I'm going to present research that I've been conducting for 5.5 years in Bogota with street youth. We've had different projects, particularly focusing on substance abuse, sexual exploitation, human trafficking of different children and youth that are found in Bogota, Colombia, on the streets, that live, work, or spend the majority of their time in the center of the city. Today I'm going to be sharing the methodologies and some ethical reflections on a project that my research team has been conducting for the last 4 years, and a specific shorter study in the last year, specifically on shoe glue and bazuco substance abuse amongst children and adolescent street youth. So when doing this research with vulnerable children and youth, and we'll talk about that category of vulnerability, we have decided over the course of 5 years to use participatory action research as the research frame. Because working with such delicate topics and such vulnerable populations makes it difficult to turn your back on the population once the formal research projects or data collection is over. And so we've asked ourselves, our research team, which is composed of street youth and also of academic researchers, we've asked ourselves over the course of 5 years, how can we represent and work with such delicate, vulnerable populations? What methods can we use? What ethical praxis and protocols should we use when working with children that live, work, consume, are exploited on the streets? How do we research and design a research project with youth that have substance abuse problems? How do we represent these populations? Is it ethical to show their photos, as we see here in this slide? How can we design projects that are meaningful for these populations and that it's not just simply taking information from them for our academic benefit? These are questions that we've asked on our research team, and I'm going to share some of the ways that we've started to resolve these ethical dilemmas. In an article that I wrote in 2012, I wrote about the informed consent process when working with vulnerable children and youth.
Amy, I think we've lost your audio.
Oh. And projects using participatory action research is to not... Yes?
We lost you for a couple of minutes there since the last slide. So would you mind just repeating any important points that you'd like from that, just to make sure we catch it all?
Sure. Just let me know if you're having problems hearing. But my point on this slide was about the informed consent process. And that in the informed consent process, and in the process of receiving formal signatures, legal permission to conduct research, we often pull field relations in the opposite direction instead of establishing trust with the population. And I wrote an article in 2012 about this process. And so what we have proposed from our research team is to focus much less on formal institutional ethical protocols and focus more on care ethics praxis in the field process. That focuses on ideals such as reciprocity. How can we share knowledge, create knowledge together, instead of creating distance between the research team and between research populations? Something that has been important in our research is friendship and creating ways to share spaces, creating ways to ground a care ethics framework in participatory action research. And how do we do that? By constructing relationships of trust in the research process, by sharing spaces, by giving children and youth control over the research process, by including them in research design, by promoting activities that are not so academically centered. When working with children and youth, we have to explore new praxis for spending time with youth, designing activities that are fun for them and that make knowledge construction an interesting, fun process for children and youth. And we also have to spend a significant amount of time within the field creating trust, becoming a familiar face. And so our research team has spent, at the beginning of every project, we spend between 6 and 8 months building trust on the streets with different relevant actors. And so 6 years ago, we started building this research team with 2 of the street girls that you see here. We started to identify areas or study sites of the city where they wanted to work. And so we worked in public spaces such as this plaza called La Mariposa that you see here. We work also in drug consumption zones, this zone known as La L. Our team works in neighborhoods where in this particular project where there's drug consumption, shoe glue, and bazuco use, and other drug consumption areas known as Barrio San Bernardo. After identifying study sites, we identify ways to actually achieve social transformation in our research praxis. And so some of these main research actors that started working on these projects with me 5.5 years ago identified different creative ways to start making a difference. So these girls in particular decided to start a music group, a hip-hop group, that's called Sniff the Change, or in Spanish, Huele el Cambio. And the idea was, instead of consuming shoe glue and using shoe glue, smelling or sniffing shoe glue to escape their problems, to escape the abuse that they lived in their lives, they decided to sing and write lyrics of change and start doing public presentations in order to motivate their peers. We also participated and designed writing workshops to another form of expressing the way that they felt about their substance abuse issues and other issues that they wanted to explore through the projects. And we also participated in public presentations in order to talk about our research, to present findings, and also to find support in some of the power structures in Bogota, which is important. And so in institutional spaces, which was the U.S. Embassy event, and university spaces. So what we've done over the course of 5.5 years is create a research team where we are all research actors working together as a community of researchers. As a community of researchers that have defined empowerment for themselves and what that means, have defined different practices to ground empowerment, which is often a meaningless term. Using reciprocity and friendship always to ground participatory action research and to make the projects meaningful. And so in this past year, our research team has identified, and the 3 research actors that you've seen in several of the pictures decided they wanted to work with their peers in a project on shoe glue and bazuco abuse. And what was the focus and objective of this study? The girls wanted to find a way to overcome the discrimination and stigma that they experience in society, that they experience on the streets. And so we wanted to find a way to project and to humanize these populations so that they're not just seen as addicts. So we conducted a series of research phases for this particular study in the last year, where we focused on shoe glue and bazuco use. This study was smaller, included 10 exploratory interviews, working with 20 different research actors and 4 focus groups. Our study started with different ways of gaining trust with the population. Our research team went and worked in an institution where street girls transition off the streets. It's partially a rehab program, partially reintegration and educational program. So we tried to find ways to collect information without being intrusive, without creating more stigma and feelings of discrimination that these girls and youth have always experienced. So how do we ask these difficult questions about the path to substance abuse? We designed exploratory interviews with research actors actors, so always designing instruments with the population is key in order to use language that is not offensive, in order to use language that is sensitive to the needs and to the experiences of research actors. We included in this study a characterization of substance abuse, and so we included visual elements in the interview, a timeline about the history of substance abuse, and we also conducted focus groups using a social cartography focus in order to spatially identify the patterns of substance abuse, where different emotional geographies associated with substance abuse, and these different drug consumption zones. As you can see, the instrument has different variables that participants map and represent. So this is a way of visualizing meaning through maps. And also, on a much larger and group surface, we used poster board to draw and talk about dreams. So not just staying in the past, but making sure to talk about the future, which is key for having results that can enable us to work against the stigma that these populations have always experienced. We also had a phase of discourse analysis, so looking at media, the way that these populations are represented in different principal news sources, also sending information requests to 11 state entities, that 5 of which were involved with in the construction and implementation of rehabilitation programs, and 6 of which are involved in interventions in these drug consumption zones, so police and military interventions. And we ask in these petitions or information requests about the focus of these interventions, and if really we're approaching the design of programs and interventions thinking and consulting with the population what their needs are. And we found that largely no. We also analyzed other types of discourse, such as social cleansing flyers, so different illegal armed groups that dedicate their time to social cleansing killings in the city of street youth and other deviant populations. I'm not going to focus on results, just so that we can cover that in the question and answer period if you're interested. But in general, we have information about the pathways to substance abuse, specifically shugo and basuco, focusing on abuse in early childhood, neglect, hunger, different experiences of trauma. We also have results about the problems within child protection institutions, discrimination that the girls live when they start rehabilitation programs, or even just in generalized child protection institutions, discrimination for sexual orientation, sexual abuse, or even learning and starting to consume within institutions. So overall, we see a pattern of transience and constant movement between 3 different spaces: home spaces, institutional spaces, and street spaces. And these populations that have worked in our projects have expressed in multiple ways that they choose the street because it's where they belong. It's where they are loved and accepted. Whereas in institutions and at home, they leave for various reasons of abuse, discrimination, or a lack of efficient program planning based on the needs of these populations. So I'd like to end with the point about sustainable structures of care in the research projects that we conduct. When the funding runs out, we face an ethical dilemma of what to do. Do we turn our back on the population? Do we leave? Do we thank them for their collaboration and wish them luck with their substance abuse problems and with all of the other issues and concerns they've shared with us? Or what can we do as researchers? And this is what participatory and youth-driven participatory action research can offer us. So in all of the projects that we conduct, we seek ways to continue following up with the community, continue working with the community so that we're not only identifying dreams, but we're helping construct pathways towards those dreams. We also, in November of last year, conducted a participatory conference with the research actors, and this is key. Because normally in academic events, who is the expert? Usually it's academics talking about what they've learned from populations. But what we have tried to do in several events, in public presentations that we've conducted over the years, is to destabilize this notion of expert. And to let research populations speak for themselves in academia and also in public spaces, also in front of and presenting to the very institutions that design programs for them. So this was a very powerful event where we also included a photo exhibit where the girls were able to re-represent themselves to society the way that they want to be seen and the way that they want to be represented, the way that they wish society would treat them. I'm not sure that we have time for a video that we made with our research team and with Street Youth.
Amy, I think we...
I want to... Do we have time?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'd like to share this video that we made with Street Youth. And this is an example of participatory video.
Sorry.
So these are the research actors from the most recent project, and they decided what type of video they wanted to make, which they decided it was a music video.
La vida tiene su control y a veces yo de nuevo te paras sin alguna razón, sin medir tiempo y voy mirando cada vez más lento. No sabe qué pueda suceder, hay que estar y quiero escucha esto. Esto es toda parte importante. No necesito de que me pares y suba sin pero y cuando vayas a mirar yo me pregunté, este es mi juego. No, 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 no. 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 No. Dame agua para respirar y botar manos a cuero que la gente tira al pasar y queda malos momentos que la gente tira al pasar y queda malos momentos. Necesito de que me pare y esto va sin reloj. Y cuando vayas a mirar, yo me pregunté, ¿este es mi juego? Y si tengo que morirme, lo haré primero, antes de borrar lo que siento, diciendo pura lo que ve, el sentimiento detrás del reloj. Detrás.
Encontramos en zona rural de Oaxaca un oso perezoso que perdió su rumbo. Se aferró durante horas a una rama para escapar del asedio de los curiosos.
Con la ayuda de bomberos.
So I'll just finish these last slides, but that's an example of participatory video and how we can use visual methods without exploiting the image of these vulnerable populations. So one other note, we've started a group of students, street populations or street youth, and some of the research actors that have participated in our project over time. And we recently founded an NGO to work against social exclusion because we found many times that in academia, the action component of our action research is limited. So now we can take questions and we can return to any of the slides. I went through a lot of information quickly, so we can take questions if there are any.
Yes, and please, everyone, send questions through either the question function or the chat function, depending on what you have available. I have a question here from Tim. What do research participants want to change, and how have they moved towards achieving change in 5 years? Recognizing that these young people have limited power to influence their street environments, to what extent has change been dependent not on the participants, but on traditional institutional action? And therefore, to what extent has the PAR influenced institutional practices?
That's a great question. Should we take a few questions, or do you want me to answer one at a time?
Let's start with that one, and then we will go into a few questions at once.
Okay, great. That's a great question, Tim. What do street youth want to change? That's a very individual-based question. And so in our projects, each of the research actors identify what they want to work on. In my experience while working with street youth in Bogota, there are some very basic things they want to change, which is the discrimination that they experience, which we've tried to work against through public presentation lessons and by inviting important institutional actors that can then make pertinent policy or program changes. In terms of substance abuse, that's another area that some of the principal research actors have identified, and that's why we conducted this study. It's not working in rehab. These programs are failing. So how can we work against substance abuse through the projects that we conduct? One of the efforts was the Hip Hop for Change program, where the girls focus their energy on another form of expression and another form of dealing with and overcoming some of these, some of the abuse and trauma that they experienced in childhood and on the streets. In terms of institutional changes, we have institutional allies that work on several projects with us, but we have still yet to make an impact at the institutional level, because at the institutional level, these populations are still, for example, some of the responses that we received from our petitions to some of these state institutions contained discriminatory discourse, saying that these populations are impossible, they're too difficult, it's too difficult to have an impact, they don't care about their lives. And so as long as institutions continue to think that way and don't train their officials and operators to work with street girls and street youth, then I don't know, I think we have a long way to go yet.
All right, we have a few more questions. I'm going to bundle a few together here. First of all, how many youth participated in your research? Second, what are the youngest children you've worked with using these methods, and how does that change what you can do? And finally, for this batch, what types of incentives were offered to the youth that you worked with, if any were offered at all?
Okay. The first question, how many youth participated? In this recent study in the last year, we had 20 research actors. In the previous larger study funded by the National Science Foundation, we worked with 33 research actors over the course of 6 different research phases. And so we have still a large amount of qualitative information, both ethnographic and geographic, that we still have to publish and circulate. In terms of the age, we've worked with youth in the age range from 9 to in the lower 30s, depending on the project. If we're working with transgender youth, then we've worked in the age range from 20 to 30. Working with street youth and consumption problems, we've worked with younger youth between the ages of 9 and 17 in one project. In other projects that I've conducted on child poverty, we worked with younger youth using very similar visual methods, social cartography, roving focus groups, exploratory interviews, and this visual methods are very effective with younger children and with adolescents as well. In terms of incentives, in the National Science Foundation study, I was able to justify compensation for principal research actors, since we were conducting 6 layers of data collection with this population. This occupies at least 2 to 3 days consecutively of data collection. And the ethics of compensation is complicated. Do we give money? That's not the best idea. If these are populations that have substance abuse problems, how can we compensate them for their time, especially considering that if they don't work on the streets that day, they have nowhere to sleep. And so what we ended up doing with the compensation that we were able to give them from the National Science Foundation, we would pay for their pay-per-day hotel rooms or do grocery shopping, another different form of compensation other than just cash. And in this past study on Shugu and Basuko, we were also able to pay peer leaders who have been trained over the course of other projects and no longer have substance abuse problems. And so in this case, we paid in cash. In terms of incentives, not all research actors receive compensation. One of the central principles of participatory action research is that research actors do not participate if they're not interested in helping grow the movement and these different activities that we're doing. We normally just compensate peer leaders who help with research design, who conduct the interviews, and then depending on how much time is required from other research actors, then we negotiate compensation.
All right, the next batch of questions are sort of about the process. We're asked, where can we find the best practices and different methodologies that you used? It looks like they may be in the articles you cited, but are they anywhere else? Second question, similar, what can be used as an indicator of progress when working with street children or writing proposals for working with street children? And how can you make programs sustainable after the funding runs out? Finally, can you talk a little bit about the training of facilitators and interviewers working in participatory methods?
Okay, so where can we find best practices? The Consortium for Street Children, which is an international organization based in London, we can share the website. We've been working on a toolkit for best practices for mainly NGOs, but I think academics can learn a lot from this toolkit that's going to be published and launched in April. That's one source for more practical information. Two of the articles that I cited in the presentation that I've written, one dealing much more with ethics and the other about the participatory action research process. There's also scholarly journals on action research. There's an action research journal, and there are other journals that publish this type of research. But particularly with youth, I think the best way is to consult with academics that have conducted this type of work and consult with organizations that work with these populations who use a lot of participatory methods, participatory video. In terms of an indicator of progress for working with street youth, when using participatory methods, one of the ways that we indicate progress and if our programs are effective or if we're having an impact, whether that impact is qualitative or quantitative, we can consult with the population. And I think this is one of the best ways. Public presentations, testimonies about the project and what sorts of changes they've experienced. video is a great way to distribute that information and also prioritize research actors' voices. In terms of sustainability of projects, this is a very good question. It requires us as academics to basically have two different profiles and work a lot of overtime, work on weekends. Maintaining contact with the research population is difficult, and that's why most academics don't do it. There's no time, there's no funding. We've already gotten what we need out of it to publish and to move forward, so why continue with the population? Well, that's what all of the PAR literature discusses and critiques about academia and the colonial legacy within academia. And so in order for projects to be sustainable, what do we recommend? We recommend starting movements with research actors so that progress doesn't depend on us as academics. If we have less involvement after the project, we know that we have helped to construct sustainable structures of change within the community before we become less connected. Not necessarily that we leave, but we start with other projects. We have to teach classes, we have to write articles, we have to go to conferences, and so it's difficult to maintain presence with all the communities that you'll work in. But I think that's the key, is this idea of empowerment from within the community, and that the community really takes control of the project.
Some questions regarding the participants. First, how did you create trust with the participants, and what methods did you use? Second, you discussed ethical norms about using participants' photos. What did your participants decide on, and how did you develop new ethical rules or norms with them? Finally, of the 53 research actors, what specific changes do they say they have influenced for themselves, and how does this compare with their visions for a different future?
The first question, I got the second and third, but the first question, could you repeat that? Sorry, I'm just taking notes.
Of course. How did you create trust with the participants, and what methods did you use?
Okay. So in terms of creating trust, we use, in the case of our projects, we spent at least 6 to 8 months before starting formal data collection, although gaining trust, doing different types of activities, aerobics, dance, different ways to share spaces that are not necessarily academic. In other cases, cooking together, or even going out to dance together. And so very non-traditional ways of conducting academic research, but really the only way to gain trust so that these populations don't feel exploited and feel that we actually are constructing friendship is by really getting to know and getting to know one another and forming a research team. And so usually this takes time. In terms of the getting access, we worked with starting to establish contacts in the different study sites, using public health outreach, such as going to the streets initially when I first arrived in Colombia 6 years ago with an NGO and passing out condoms. Although our research team over the development of our projects is more critical of that approach, as we always want to accompany sort of the passing out of items with some sort of non-material exchange, whether that's knowledge or a workshop on their rights, or so all different kinds of activities. In terms of photos, this is a very delicate issue. All of the photos that I've showed today, I have permission from the principal research actors to use and circulate these photos. We have informed consent from all of the participants that we have worked with over the years, but we always consult before doing an academic presentation or before publishing an article as to whether they want these photos to be circulated. So it's always, there are very particular ethical dilemmas and protocols that we have to follow when it comes to visual methods and dissemination. In terms of the specific changes within the population, depending on the different groups of street youth that we've worked with, these changes depend and vary. In some cases, the focus was on fighting for sexual rights, and sexual and reproductive rights, the right to exercise their sexual orientation within institutions. For example, within the transgender population, we've done different campaigns surrounding social cleansing. Identifying, obviously, this is one of the most violent forms of discrimination and hate crimes, are social cleansing killings. And so different public presentations in which the research actors can cry out against injustice. Changes in terms of substance abuse are much slower because this is a lifelong battle. But we've seen girls return with their families, if that's what they want, if those are good memories, start to gradually transition out of street spaces, if that's what they want, so that they're less exposed to the temptation of glue or bazuco. And so we see gradual changes. We've also had one of our principal research actors that obtained a university post here as a community researcher with us, and then worked briefly with one of the state institutions as a community researcher, although that didn't go very well because of certain differences with the way that research was conducted by the state, because that person felt as though they were exploiting the population and she didn't want to be involved. So there's a variety of changes, and it really depends on the project objectives that we identify with each group.
All right, we just have about 5 minutes left here and a bunch of questions, so I'll give you the batch of questions that don't quite go together. Two are follow-ups from your last responses. First, when you don't have months to gain that trust, like in an emergency setting, how do you create a similar sort of trust, though it may not be as deep as in if you have 6 or 8 months, but how do you create this trust in an emergency setting where you don't have the sense of time? The second is, at the beginning, you mentioned that getting genuinely informed consent is difficult, and often informed consent is superficial. So how do you get truly informed consent? You touched on this briefly, but what is the participation of formal institutions? And in your work, did you have government, police, health sector participation in the activities with the groups, and how did it affect the participatory nature of the research? two more questions before our last one. First, do you see similarities between street youth and child soldiers, and how can we learn from the extensive research on child soldiers to inform street youth interventions, especially in terms of the reintegration piece? Do you envision expanding your work to reach more members of this population, and how so? And finally, I think you've talked about this extensively, challenges with participatory action research. So that is a lot. I'm sorry. We have about 5 minutes.
The second to last one I missed. I missed the question between street youth and child soldiers and the challenges with PAR. There was one in there that I didn't get.
Yes. How do you envision expanding your work to reach more members of this population?
Okay. Okay. So the first question, when you don't have months to gain trust, such as in an emergency setting, what different praxis or methodologies could we use? Well, I think empathy is one of the guiding principles of PAR, and so really just spending as much time as you can with the population and really showing that you care. And that's what care ethics really is how can we care and how can we show research actors that we care? And there's a whole literature on care ethics. And the article I wrote in 2012 on care ethics talks about this a lot. In emergency settings, I think that just sharing as many spaces and as much time as you can with the population, listening to life histories, to their stories, making sure to tell, to explain your positionality and what your role is there. How do you get truly informed consent? That's a great question. Also in the 2012 article, I talk about informed consent and how we can focus much more on this idea of informing participants about what the project entails. And in a PAR project, since we're constructing the project together, this process of informed consent has a different order, because we are not designing the project and then presenting it to populations, but this is happening simultaneously. We're constructing the research design with the population. And so over time, obviously, before recording or collecting formal information that will be transcribed or circulated, we need a signature, and that's just legal, institutional ethics. But beforehand, it's not necessary in these moments of gaining trust, in these moments when a signature might have some sort of ramification for that trust. And how to really obtain informed consent would be constantly talking with research actors about how this information is going to be used, how we're going to use it together to make a change, and making sure that everyone's on the same page, that nothing is hidden, that there are no hidden agendas. In terms of the participation of institutions in our projects, we have a particular project. You asked about police. We have a project on police abuse, actually. So the idea is with street populations, mostly minor and adolescent populations have a lot of run-ins with the police. And so we are designing action research projects currently to work both with the street youth population and with police to try to overcome these very problematic and abusive and violent relations. In terms of other institutions, we've worked with district-level rehab institutions, but the relationship is fragile. And because obviously we have information about some of the inefficiencies and problems within the institutions, and circulation becomes problematic, especially when we have these types of public events, when we're saying things that are very difficult for institutions to hear. But nonetheless, we keep working with them because that's how public policy changes can start to be made from action research. In terms of the similarities between street youth and child soldiers, I think that in terms of trauma and the different abuse that street youth populations have lived, there in the child soldier literature, there's a lot of information as to how to work with populations that have lived through trauma and that are victims of violence, and especially in the Colombian context, armed conflict. So I think there is a lot that can be learned in terms of methodologies and dealing with those traumas that are many times linked to substance abuse as a way of escaping trauma. How do I envision expanding our work to reach more populations? I'm in this type of work, I'm much less concerned about numbers and about the impact that we're having within the community. We can't focus so much on numbers because this type of work requires very close relationships and very hard work over a long period of time. And so more and more we have contact with different populations in Bogota at the national scale through the NGO. That's sort of our vision for the future, for the action component, is starting to do a lot more community-based action work that may not have necessarily an academic agenda. And as an academic, I'll always be accompanying both efforts, both academically and in terms of action. And the challenges of PAR, there are many challenges. We actually have a panel on the ethical challenges that we face in participatory action research in the annual meeting of the Association of American Geographers this April, where we're presenting on this. We're organizing a panel on this. So we'll eventually have a paper coming out. One of the central issues that we'll be discussing is close relations in the research process are necessary for action research, but they're very difficult. There are problems that arise. There are feelings involved. These are real human relationships, which a lot of times we forget in academic research. And so those are one of the main challenges, dealing with interpersonal conflicts in the research team. Balancing what we need as academics to continue moving forward with our careers, which is a reality, and what the community needs, which is even more important. So these are dilemmas that we have to balance throughout these projects. So there are many challenges, but the outcome of action research is really social transformation and some sort of change within the community, even if it's just at the individual level.
All right. I want to thank you, Amy, for sharing so much information about your research and the ethics and process for participatory action research. I think it's been really insightful for me, and I think I feel comfortable saying that probably for everyone else on the line as well. It's been very interesting, and I think we've all learned a lot, and thank you everyone for participating and submitting such insightful questions. And we will have a recording of the webinar. It will be available in just a few days on our YouTube site, on the CPC Learning Network YouTube site. And we will also share it out through our newsletter. So be on the lookout for that in case you missed pieces of the webinar. I know people have been coming in and out a little bit. So this will all be available online. And thank you again, Amy, for sharing your research with us.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone for participating.
And one last question, sorry. We've been asked if the PowerPoint can be made available. I don't know, Amy, if you're comfortable.
Yes.
Sure. All right. So we will share.
We can make it available.
Perfect. So we will send out the PowerPoint and in the next couple of days. All right. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.